Good morning. In John 18, we are quickly approaching the climax of the gospel, Jesus' hour of glory, the crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension. John's entire gospel has been building toward this hour. In fact, all of history from eternity past, when the word was in the beginning with God, has been building to this hour. And as we walk through the arrest and trials of Jesus, watch how John crafts his narrative, always with the purpose that we may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing we may have life in his name. We stay connected with the farewell discourse as we begin chapter 18, when Jesus has spoken these words, referring to the teaching of John 14 through 16 and the beautiful prayer of Jesus from chapter 17. Julia, now it's time for action.
That's right. John tells us that Jesus went out with his disciples. Now, they're either leaving the upper room just now at this point, or if they've been walking, they're going out now of the walled part of the city. They cross the brook Kidron, which is actually a steep valley with a riverbed that flows only following the winter rains. And then they enter a walled garden, which is an olive grove. And the synoptics identified this as the Garden of Gethsemane. Verse 2 adds that it was a place where Jesus took his disciples regularly. So Judas is confident that is where Jesus will plan to spend the night. After Jesus had sent Judas out from the Last Supper to do quickly what he had planned, Judas went and collaborated with the Jewish religious authorities for Jesus' arrest. But we see in verse 3, he comes with not only the Jewish temple police, he also has with him a detachment of Roman soldiers, possibly anywhere from 200 to 600 men. It seems that this arresting party has the upper hand against a poor Galilean peasant and his friends. Oh, but just watch as the action unfolds. Things are not always seen as they seem on the surface. And we will see throughout, Jesus is the one in control. Verse 4, Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward. Jesus didn't just suspect there was a plan to arrest him that night. He knew all that would happen to him. But still, he went right to where Judas thought he would be. And rather than waiting for the soldiers to grab him, Jesus initiates the contact. Whom do you seek? The soldiers answered, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus replied with no hesitation, I am he. Now, John tells us that Judas was standing there, but the synoptics add that Judas kissed Jesus as confirmation of his identity. And then John adds a wonderful detail in verse 6. When Jesus said, I am he, the soldiers drew back and fell to the ground. There was something about Jesus' commanding presence that caused hardened Roman soldiers to fall back in awe. And of course, for John's readers, and possibly some of the Jewish officers in the crowd, they understood I am is an echo of God's way of identifying himself to Moses. And so they fell back in awe at the very presence of God among them. It's an appropriate response, even if they don't understand it. Verse 7, Jesus initiates again with the same question. Whom do you seek? Same answer, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus points out he's already told them that I am he. But here he adds, so if you seek me, let these men go. And he's fulfilling here his prayer of commitment from John 17 that he would protect and care for and not lose even one of his own. Jesus, in total control of the situation, asks no mercy for himself, but he lovingly looks after his disciples. Melanie, one of those disciples just can't help himself. He has to get involved.
Oh, yes, Peter. Dear impetuous Peter draws his sword, likely a small dagger or knife, and swings wildly, cutting off the right ear of Malchus, the high priest's servant. Did you catch the details John included here? He specifies it was the right ear, and he names the servant. Peter shows courage here, but his tactic was as pointless as his misunderstanding was total, to quote Don Carson. Now, Jesus corrected Peter in verse 11. Put your sword into its sheath. In other words, don't fight this moment for which I have been preparing for you. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? John doesn't record Jesus' prayer of agony in Gethsemane, but we see here his prayer lived out. Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Jesus is fully committed to drinking the cup which the Father has given him. Our lesson helped us to see more of the symbolism behind this cup. It is the Father's cup of wrath, his judgment for sin. Again, this is all God's plan, and Jesus is willingly laying down his life. Julia, as Jesus willingly submits to this awful cup, what are the authorities doing?
Well, we see in verse 12, they arrested Jesus and bound him, as if their ropes around his hands could really contain the Son of God. Then the trials begin, first with the Jewish authorities. They take him in verse 13 to Annas' home. Now, Annas had been high priest from AD 6 to 15 when Rome removed him from the office. But at this time, he still has enormous support from the people and influence with them because they really resented Rome controlling this office of high priest. His family was known for their wealth, their power, and their greed. 5 of his own sons became high priests, as well as his son-in-law, Caiaphas, who is the high priest at this time. Still being quite powerful, Annas retained that title of high priest as a courtesy. So Jesus is taken first to his home. Likely Caiaphas is busy at this point assembling the members of the Sanhedrin for the formal trial. John again ironically reminds us in verse 14, Caiaphas has already declared it would be expedient for one man to die for the people. And so this is a trial that isn't really a trial. They have already decided at this point that Jesus must die. Melody, the story now moves back and forth as John paints a wonderful contrast between Peter and Jesus in this moment.
Yes, we left Peter being rebuked for the sword fiasco, which we learned from Luke actually ended well when Jesus healed Malchus's ear, likely keeping Peter from being arrested himself. Now, verse 15, Peter and another disciple follow Jesus. The other disciple isn't named, but the most likely candidate is the Apostle John himself, since he doesn't identify himself personally in this entire gospel. And he and Peter are often closely connected in the synoptics. This other disciple was known by the high priest, so he was able to gain entrance into the courtyard easily. We wonder how a Galilean fisherman like John would be well enough known to have easy access to the home of the high priest. But John's family is wealthy enough to own their own fishing business and have hired hands working for them. Some even suggest that John's family may supply fish to Annas' household. John writes the scene with so many personal eyewitness details, it makes sense that he is the other unnamed disciple. John speaks to the servant girl at the door, and she allows him to bring Peter into the courtyard. But she adds a comment, verse 17. You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you? Peter, likely not even blinking or thinking twice, responds, I am not. Peter wants to get inside, and the servant girl might block his entry if she knows the truth. And so he denies being a disciple of Jesus. Verse 18. John adds the details that it is cold, and so the servants and officers have built a charcoal fire to warm themselves. We leave Peter there by the fire. Meanwhile, Julia, what's happening inside Annas' house?
Well, in verse 19, John refers to Annas as the high priest, using that courtesy title. Annas has questions for Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Now, his concern with the disciples may be an attempt to discover the size of his following and what potential they had for conspiring against Rome. This would be an important point to gain Rome's help in condemning Jesus. But the real concern of the religious authorities is Jesus' teaching. Who are you claiming to be? Will you lead the people astray? In other words, to what extent does Jesus threaten their interests? Jesus refuses to be drawn into Annas' game or to make statements that they could use against him. Instead, he points out that he has been speaking and teaching openly in the synagogues and in the temple. He has no secret or different teaching he has given to his disciples. Ask the people who heard me speak. They know what I said. And this is also a subtle reminder that this would be how a proper interrogation or a trial would happen, with the testimony of witnesses. One of the officers takes offense and strikes Jesus with his hand. But Jesus doesn't back down. Again, who is in charge? Jesus points out that if what he said is wrong, there are proper ways to deal with it, to bear witness legally about the wrong. But if he speaks truth, why strike him? I think at this point, Annas knows that he will get nowhere. He is not getting an incriminating statement, nothing that could be used against Jesus at a formal trial. And so he sends Jesus on to Caiaphas for the formal trial before the full Sanhedrin. Likely this first questioning has occurred in Annas' home, which is possibly adjacent to the home of his son-in-law Caiaphas, who is now the high priest. So while Annas sends Jesus next door, John takes us back outside. Melody, we find Peter still warming himself by that charcoal fire in verse 25.
Well, yes, things for Peter are about to heat up rather quickly. Remember, he's standing by the fire with the servants and officers, and some of them, seeing his face more clearly in the firelight, ask, "You are not one of his disciples, are you?" Notice it is the exact same question the servant girl at the door had asked Peter. And sadly, his response is just the same: "I am not." What a contrast to Jesus' response. Brown points out that Jesus stands up to his accusers and denies nothing, while Peter cowers before his questioners and denies everything. John is weaving his story so that we see the awesome control and courage of Jesus contrasted with the fear and denials of Peter. Verse 26, another challenge to Peter, this time from someone who's a relative of Malchus. "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter again denied it, and at once, a rooster crowed. Mark records that Peter went out and wept bitterly. John quietly reminds us with the detail of the rooster crowing that Jesus had known exactly what would happen to Peter on that night. Peter's impetuous courage, which gave way to fearful denial of the Lord, highlights his greatest vulnerability, his self-confidence. But as in our lives, Jesus will use Peter's failure to teach him, to restore him, and to make him a true and faithful witness who eventually will die for Jesus. Julia, as the dark night is giving way to the breaking of morning, the action shifts once again, and as Jesus is taken in verse 28 from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters.
John doesn't include in his account the trial before the full Sanhedrin, but the synoptics tell us that when Jesus declared before that group, "I am," they erupted and declared their verdict, which of course they had planned all along. Jesus must die. John instead focuses on the Roman trial, giving us many details not included in the synoptics. Pontius Pilate was the Roman governor over the province of Judea from AD 26 to 36, and he controlled the area harshly while trying to please Rome. He normally lived in Caesarea, but during the Jewish festivals, he would stay in Jerusalem, prepared to deal with any trouble. The Jewish religious leaders lead Jesus now to Pilate's headquarters there in Jerusalem, but they refuse to enter themselves. They are avoiding the defilement that comes from entering a Gentile residence so that they can participate in the feasts that are held throughout the entire week of Passover. Pilate knows their customs, and so he obliges them by coming outside to speak with them while Jesus is inside. Remember, the Roman soldiers were involved in Jesus' arrest, so there had likely already been some discussion with Pilate about Jesus and their desire to have him tried and condemned. So they are somewhat taken aback when Pilate holds to the legal procedures and asks, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" Verse 29. They rather petulantly reply, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." In other words, trust us. He is guilty. No need to probe further. But Pilate is not interested in their religious squabbles. Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. Now that's the problem for the Jewish authorities. Only Rome can put someone to death. They want Jesus crucified. They want him to suffer that shame. But they know, and Pilate knows, that they need his help. John reminds us again in verse 32, who is really in charge? This was to fulfill the word that Jesus himself had spoken by what kind of death he was going to die. Remember John 12:32? And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. Another subtle point that John is making here is the irony of these Jewish leaders refusing to enter Pilate's home to avoid ritual defilement. They are so concerned about their religious purity while they are plotting to crucify the Son of God. Melody, tell us what happens when Pilate begins to question Jesus.
Well, Pilate is doing the questioning, but Jesus is in total control of the situation. Verse 33, he asks, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Well, Jesus is the king of the Jews. He's the king of the entire world, but not in the way Pilate thinks of a king. And so Jesus probes Pilate's intention to his question. Do you want to know for yourself? Or are you just asking in a legal capacity? This exasperates Pilate. Am I a Jew? What have you done? Pilate is trying to figure out why the Jews want this man killed. But his only true concern is for Rome. Is this man a threat to Roman rule in the province? Is he a revolutionary who's trying to overthrow Rome and declare himself king? And so Jesus educates Pilate a bit in verse 37, declaring that yes, Jesus was born for this purpose and came into this world for this purpose. Then he blows Pilate's mind, not to be an earthly king, but to bear witness to the truth. Jesus' kingdom is not of this world. Instead, it is a kingdom of truth, and Jesus himself is the truth. His kingship is one of salvation, not political domination. And those who believe truth will listen to his voice. Jesus is inviting Pilate to listen to truth, to respond to his offer and align himself with truth. But Pilate wants nothing to do with this personally. And so he rather flippantly responds, "What is truth?" Julia, Pilate is in a bit of a quandary here. He has seen and heard enough to know that Jesus is guilty of nothing worthy of death, but he still has to deal with those Jewish authorities.
Yes, so Pilate goes back out to the Jewish leaders and declares, I find no guilt in him. Pilate wants to release Jesus, but he also wants to appease these Jewish leaders. And so he offers them an alternative solution. Since the custom is to release one Jewish prisoner during Passover, here's your choice. Release the king of the Jews or Barabbas. Oh, it must have irritated them when he refers to Jesus as king of the Jews. And of course, Pilate is speaking more truly than he realizes. There is incredible irony that the choice is to release Jesus, who is no threat to Rome because his kingdom is not of this world, or Barabbas, a robber. More than a robber, he is a zealot, a man who is a threat to Rome. Pilate's attempted appeasement backfires when the Jewish leaders, who by this time have been joined by a crowd, respond, not this man, but Barabbas. It seems that the Jewish religious leaders and the Roman rulers are in charge and that they have decided that Jesus is to die. But throughout the passage, John has made it clear Jesus is in charge, that all these things are happening just as God intended. The light is shining in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Melody, that's the good news for us, isn't it?
Yes, and it's our challenge to decide, will we be like Pilate and the Jewish leadership who refuse the light and truth, or will we believe? The climax of John is here. Next week, Jesus, still fully in control, will willingly lay down his life. He'll be crucified in unimaginable shame, which gives way to unimaginable glory. Please enjoy your study this week. We'll see you next week, and we can't wait to be with you again. Bye, y'all.